Let me tell you about the evening when trust shattered like glass dropped on marble. Quietly at first, then with an unmistakable ring that couldn't be ignored. You know those moments when someone looks directly at you and lies, and you see it happening in real time, watching their eyes flicker just slightly? This is the story of how that moment found its way into one family's life, reshaping everything they thought they understood about loyalty and intention. Marcus had always been the reliable one. The older brother who showed up on time, remembered birthdays, called home on Sundays. Their mother used to say he was the steady hand in the family, the one you could lean on when the world felt unmoored. He worked in property development. Nothing glamorous, but honest work that paid well enough. He had a wife named Diane, 2 children, a mortgage in the suburbs. The kind of life that looked solid from the outside. What you need to understand about families like this one is that they operate on a complicated currency of trust. Not blind faith, but earned confidence built over decades. Sarah, Marcus's younger sister, had been struggling with her own business venture, a small marketing firm that demanded everything from her, but gave back uncertainty. She'd come to Marcus years ago, nervous and hopeful, asking if he might consider investing. He had. Not the entire nest egg, but enough to matter. $25,000, signed on a handshake with a smile that suggested this was family helping family. Nothing more complicated than that. Sarah remembered feeling seen in that moment, understood. Her brother believed in her when her own conviction wavered. It was the kind of thing that bound people together across the small conflicts that siblings inevitably accumulate. 5 years passed. The business grew. Sarah's firm became profitable, respected even. She paid Marcus back consistently, on schedule, with interest he tried to refuse. The money flowed back to him like an acknowledgement of his faith. They had lunch together, talked about their kids, complained about their parents' health. This was normal. This was what family looked like when it worked correctly. Then came the audit. A routine examination, nothing unusual in itself, but thorough and precise. Sarah's accountant discovered discrepancies in her records, withdrawals that hadn't been explained, transfers to accounts she didn't recognize. At first, she assumed it was her own mistake, some detail she'd overlooked. Her hand shook as she scrolled through the digital trail. The amounts were specific. $25,000, extracted gradually over the course of 3 months, roughly 6 months before she'd planned to pay Marcus back his original investment. Someone had accessed her business account and carefully removed exactly the amount he'd given her. The theft was almost elegant in its precision, like someone was writing an equation in numbers. Sarah's first thought wasn't anger, it was confusion. How could this be? She called her bank, asked questions, demanded records. The transfers had been made using her credentials, but from a device she'd never seen. Or rather, she'd seen it many times. It was the laptop Marcus had given her as a gift 3 years earlier, a gesture of support when she'd complained about her aging computer. She still used it daily. When she finally called him, her voice was steady despite the way her hands trembled. She laid out what she'd found, the transfers, the timeline. the unmistakable digital footprints. She gave him space to explain, because families are built on the possibility of explanation. There was silence on the other end, the kind that stretches and becomes its own answer. Then Marcus said he didn't know what she was talking about. His voice had that quality of someone doubling down, pushing forward with conviction even though they know the ground beneath them is giving way. He suggested she was mistaken, confused maybe, that she should call the bank herself and verify. He spoke to her like she was foolish for even considering such a thing. But here's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It whispers. And when you hear that whisper turn into lies, delivered so smoothly they almost convince you that you're the one who's wrong, something settles in your chest. It's not just anger. It's a kind of awful recognition that someone you trusted has calculated what they could get away with. Sarah discovered that Marcus had been struggling financially. Not in ways that were visible, but real nonetheless. His real estate deals had soured. A business partnership had dissolved badly. Diane didn't know the full extent of it. He'd hidden some of the failures from her. He needed money, just a temporary bridge to get through a difficult season. He told himself it was borrowing, really, something he'd replace before Sarah even noticed. Except the notices came before the replacement did. What strikes me most about this particular betrayal is that Marcus had constructed an entire internal narrative to justify it. He'd invested in Sarah's business, after all. He'd taken a risk on her. In his mind, the money had been partially his, or would be eventually through the profits that would theoretically come. He was just collecting early. It was such a neat way of thinking about it, so bloodless and reasonable. Sarah met with a lawyer. She had to ask herself questions that children shouldn't have to ask about their siblings. Was this criminal? Should she report it? Could their family survive the exposure? These weren't theoretical questions. They were immediate and urgent, demanding decisions. The conversation when it came wasn't dramatic. Sarah requested Marcus meet her at a coffee shop near the city center, neutral ground that didn't belong to either of them. She brought printouts of the transfers, the bank records, the evidence arranged in chronological order. She laid them on the table like cards in a game where only one outcome was possible. Marcus's defense crumbled quickly once confronted with evidence he couldn't deny. He didn't apologize so much as explain, which is a distinctly different act. He talked about his pressures, his mounting debts, his fear. He talked about it almost like she should understand, because of course she would understand. They were family. Families helped each other, and sometimes help took complicated forms. What Sarah recognized in that moment was that her brother had already spent the money. It was gone, allocated to bills and mortgage payments and keeping up appearances. He couldn't simply return it. He could offer a payment plan, apologize, promise to fix things, but he couldn't undo what he'd done. The theft and the lie were intertwined, inseparable now. The family fractured in ways that don't always show up in family photos. Their parents weren't told immediately. Sarah needed time to process, to figure out what was true and what wasn't, which feelings were justified and which were still forming. She experienced something like grief, mourning the version of her brother that only existed before she knew what he was capable of. Diane had to be told eventually. That conversation was its own kind of tragedy, watching someone's face change as they recognize that their partner is not who they believed. She knew about some of their financial troubles, but not all of it. And she certainly hadn't known about the theft from Sarah. That betrayal had its own geometry. One person lying to another in a marriage while simultaneously betraying a sibling. Marcus's children didn't understand what had happened, just that their uncle and aunt came around less often now, and when they did, there was something tense and unspoken in the room. Children are perceptive about such things. They felt the absence of something that had been there before, even if they couldn't name what it was. Sarah did report it, ultimately. She had to protect her business, her reputation, her future. The legal system ground forward with its own particular logic, and charges were filed. The story that had been contained within family suddenly became a matter of public record. It appeared in local news, a small article about embezzlement and financial crimes. Nothing major, but real enough to embarrass, to complicate. What strikes me in reviewing this case is how ordinary it all is. Not the betrayal itself. Betrayals are rarely novel, but the circumstances surrounding it. Marcus wasn't a villain in any traditional sense. He was a person under pressure who made a choice. He was also someone who then doubled down on that choice by lying, by constructing a defense that required his sister to be misremembering or mistaken. The legal proceedings took time, as these things do. Marcus plea bargained. He faced restitution requirements and probation. It could have been worse, legally speaking. But the real consequences played out in slower time, in the texture of family relationships, in the way trust, once broken, requires such deliberate effort to rebuild, if rebuilding is even possible. Sarah went to therapy. She needed to process not just what her brother had done, but what it meant about her own judgment. She'd trusted him. How many other people would she regret trusting? Where were the signs she'd missed? This is the psychological tax of betrayal. It invades your sense of reality, makes you question your own ability to perceive truth. Years moved forward. Time doesn't heal so much as it creates distance, and distance can sometimes feel like healing. Sarah's business continued to grow. She became more careful, implemented better security measures, compartmentalized her trust more deliberately. She learned to live with ambiguity, with the knowledge that people contained contradictions. Marcus attended court-ordered counseling. He made his restitution payments consistently, rebuilding something at least partially through his compliance. Diane stood beside him through it, though their marriage had shifted. There was less lightness in their home now. Forgiveness, when it came, was complicated and conditional, the kind that acknowledges harm without fully erasing it. The family maintained contact, carefully. Holiday gatherings happened, but with a kind of choreographed politeness that hadn't been necessary before. Their mother never quite understood what had happened. She knew the facts, but seemed unable to grasp how her children could have arrived at such a juncture. Their father was more pragmatic, recognizing that this was the human condition, that people made mistakes, that the family either moved forward or it didn't. What I'm trying to suggest through all of this is that betrayal doesn't always look like what we expect. It's not always dramatic or violent. Sometimes it's calculated and careful. Sometimes it's desperate and panicked. Sometimes it's both simultaneously. A person acting strategically while also falling apart, being rational and irrational at once. Sarah eventually spoke with Marcus again, really spoke with him, in a way that acknowledged what had happened without being consumed by it. She asked him why, beyond the financial pressure, he'd stolen from her rather than asking for help. He said it was pride, shame, the inability to admit failure to someone whose success had become pointed by contrast. He said he'd told himself stories about what he was doing until those stories felt like truth. That conversation didn't restore what had been broken, but it created something different. A small platform of understanding built on the ruins of the original trust. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was movement towards something that resembled peace, the kind that accepts harm and continues anyway. Now, I want to thank you for staying with this story through to its conclusion. These narratives matter because they remind us that trust isn't simple, that family bonds are resilient but not unbreakable, and that the spaces between people are where the real work of relationship happens. If you've found value in this chronicle, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel and consider becoming a member. By doing so, you support stories like this one, accounts of ordinary complexity, human frailty, and the surprising resilience that emerges when people choose to face difficult truths together. Your membership helps us continue bringing these voices and narratives to light.